Today will be the concluding video of the Fujifilm X-S10. How do I actually feel about this camera itself? I'm Richard and welcome to Zappy Productions. This is the concluding video of the X-S10, and in addition to that, I will be covering the video functions of the X-S10 itself. Now, the X-S10 is something loaned to me by Fujifilm Singapore. I do not own this camera, but I've been using it for a month plus two, and I really love the camera itself. And if you ask me, if you don't see the entire review, I will say that if you are looking to buy an X series camera and you don't really want to spend that much money, I think this is probably the best camera out there for the X series camera. And in fact, I would recommend this over the XT series unless you really need the weather sealing and the dual cut slots. Now, let's first get the first section out of the way, which is the video quality. Before I talk about this section, take a look at my vlogging video. In fact, I'll put the link up there and you can see the vlogging video of this camera here. Just note that video was shot entirely in Full HD and the quality is really good. Now, if you have seen the video already, now let's talk about the overall quality of the footage itself. I would say as the footage itself coming out from this camera is really nice. It goes up to 200 megabits per second, so 4K 30 or Full HD, that's all good. And you really get a very nice crisp image overall. And in terms of grading and color, it is done pretty okay. I mean, you have seen my video, I can grade it quite easily to what it would have been if it was a Rec 709. So overall, the quality is pretty good really. That is of course when it comes to the footage quality in normal mode, which is 30 FPS, 25 FPS. Now I did notice that if you were to go slow-mo, which is 100, 120, 200 and 240 FPS in this camera, by the way, this camera can do it but only in Full HD mode, the quality does suffer a lot. In fact, in that video you should have seen that there is a lot more noise for those frame rates itself. So if you are looking to slow-mo with this camera, which it does a perfectly good job, I would say as you have to note that the slow-mo will result in certain drop of quality and you must accept that drop of quality, especially in the noisy shadow regions. Now that is of course for image quality itself. Then there's also the autofocus. I would say as the autofocus, as you can see in the vlogging video again, it is pretty okay. It does track my face pretty well. However, it is not the most, I would say, stable autofocus. It does occasionally drift a little, but no harm really. And if you ask me, the autofocus is perfectly usable for the purpose of vlogging. Now, if you are going to shoot a subject, however, I would say as this autofocus here is not, as I say, again, not the most stable and not the most, I would say, as confident autofocus you can get for video. That goes to probably the R5 or if not the Sony cameras. Those are a lot more confident. And if you are intending to use the autofocus for the purpose of shooting other subjects, just note they will drift and you really have to keep your eyes on the system or the LCD to ensure that the focus is always there. Now that's of course for autofocus, and I want to say something also. The autofocus also works for high-speed video, but it is just not as responsive. So sometimes it will lag a little bit before it autofocus, but that is perfectly fine. And next, we'll talk about IBIS. Now, IBIS on this camera is okay. I'll say for the purpose of video, it's pretty okay. It's the same quality, I believe, as the XT series, or maybe slightly worse off. I did notice that it is better in Full HD rather than 4K. In 4K, it is a little bit more jumpy, as you can see in this footage here. But if you look at my vlogging footage, which was in Full HD, it's pretty okay. So I'm not really sure if am I using it correctly, or maybe in Full HD it's doing a little bit more processing or what. But that said, the overall IBIS is okay for the purpose of vlogging, but if you are intending to handhold video and shoot subjects, you really have to take note that the video image stabilization is probably not the best overall. And there's also something I want to talk about is because, you know, there is image stabilization, so you tend to handhold and then maybe try to pan. There is quite a little bit of the rolling shutter effects you can see in this video here. It just makes everything slightly slanted and a slightly more blur. So that is something you must note with this camera. The sensor is good, one of the fastest sensors, but definitely not the fastest. And things like rolling shutter does appear on this camera itself if you are panning. Now, if the subject is just zooming across the screen, I don't think that's a problem. Usually it's only panning that causes such rolling shutter artifacts. So now, one thing I did notice regarding using IBIS and wide-angle lens is that it results in certain wobble. I think this is a well-known fact for cameras with IBIS, but the wobble in the X-S10 is actually quite if you ask me, bad, because if you actually see the camera moving forward, the wobble is intense. For the purpose of vlogging in 4K, it wasn't that bad, but if you vlog in actually Full HD, for some reason the wobble is a lot lesser. So I'm not sure what is causing the wobble, and is it due to processing power or resolution? But yeah, wobble is quite bad if you're facing forward with 4K, not so bad if you're vlogging, and quite minimal if you're using Full HD resolution. And that's about it really for in terms of IB's functionality. And then lastly, I would say, does this camera overheat? Yes, it does overheat, but it takes like 50 something minutes. In fact, I tried twice. One is 54 minutes, the other is 56 minutes. But just to note, this camera only records to 29.59 minutes. It doesn't record beyond that. You have to restart the recording again. So there is some weird legacy limitations you have on this camera. And secondly, the battery do not last longer than the recording itself. In fact, I find that the battery dies like 40 to 50 minutes later. I don't know, is it the quality of the battery, or maybe I didn't fully charge it, but I tried a few times. It dies about 40 to 50 minutes if you were recording 4K. It overheats after the battery dies. So I mean, I saw it die and replace it quickly, but 54 to 56 minutes is what you would expect out of this camera in about room temperature, about 24-25 degrees Celsius, as you can see in this photo here. So this camera does overheat, but not a big deal. When I was vlogging, I never once see it overheat before, and neither do I ever see, it has the warning. By the way, it does have a warning sign. I forget to capture the image here, but I never seen a warning when I was vlogging around for like 20-30 minutes. And that's about it for the video functions. Now let's talk about its photography function, and ultimately, should you actually buy this camera itself? Now just to note, this is not going to be an in-depth review in any way. I already done the review earlier. In fact, take a look at the link above, and there are some other links that will pop up occasionally. But I have already done like 2 videos on this camera regarding its usability and overall how I feel about it, and those things pretty much hold. And just to note, this is the X-T4 sensor, so expect the same image quality as the X-T4. As such, I wouldn't really go too in-depth into image quality too, because pretty much I like Fuji colors, and I don't want to go around and regurgitating what everybody has been saying out there regarding the X-T4. It is the exact same 26 megapixel sensor. Now, first, when it comes to ergonomics, I would say as the best part is overall ergonomics. For a small camera, is one of the best I ever have. It is very comfortable to grip. Overall, the weight is very nice for one hand, and probably the most, if you ask me, in terms of handling, in terms of holding, in terms of usage in the field, when it comes to grip, at least, this is the best camera out there today for any small camera out there. I have tried quite a few, and I would definitely say that this thing is the most enjoyable small camera you can get your hands on today. The only bad thing about this camera, if you ask me from the ergonomic standpoint, is the lack of buttons. There is the D buttons that is available in some of the older series. You only have now a big LCD with joystick, and there's 2 buttons here. So the lack of buttons means that you have to really choose what you want to customize, and there is a lot of functions. But most of the time, you probably want to use only a few key ones, such as white balance setting or maybe autofocus on press button. It depends on what you want. To some people, this may be a major limitation, and as there's not enough buttons really to press on this camera itself. Now, other than that, it's pretty okay, man. I mean, the screens, everything are pretty nice. I did notice something, and I will talk about it now also, in fact, since I'm talking about the screen. When it comes to manual focus lenses, so I actually use this camera with some manual focus lens. In fact, a very fast manual focus lens that I will review in the future. That is like a f/0.95. I did notice that the camera itself, when it comes to the back screen, is not very reliable. It just doesn't feel sharp enough. I remember this panel here is lower resolution than the X-T4 panel, but really when you manual focus, you really notice that. The EVF, however, is okay, very reliable. You can trust the EVF when it comes to sharpness. When it comes to the back LCD, it's really hard to gauge. And as such, if you are intending to use it with manual lenses, just to note, try to use with the EVF, not the back LCD, as it's just really not as good as you probably want it to be. Other than that, there is really no big deal issues about this camera when it comes to general ergonomics and handling. I quite really love to handle this out and feel. So overall, I would say it's a very nice camera handle. Yes, there's one more thing. Once again, the dials are not easily settable. There are some things you cannot do, like ISO. You cannot just set a dial. You have to press the ISO button. There is an ISO button here. But yeah, you cannot just anyhow set the ISO itself. So that's something to note. And that, okay, quite a nice camera. In fact, one of the best camera to use when it comes to ergonomics for a small camera size system. Now, there is also one more thing I did want to say in terms of functions and form factor. There is actually, this screw that we usually use to mount it on tripods, the tripod mounting screw. After I use it a while, I did notice it's not in the center. It's like slightly off center. I'm not sure if you can see it, but yeah, it's slightly off center. It is like slanted to the right a little bit. So when you mount it on a tripod, it's really weird. And if you're intending to fly this camera on gimbals, you also notice that, yeah, it's not in the center and it's just slightly offset. So that's really something to note on this camera. The tripod mount is not in the center itself. Now, that is ergonomics itself. Now, the other thing I'll talk about is autofocus and general, usage in the field. I'll say as usage in the field, in terms of autofocus, IBIS is really nice, a good experience. Overall, IBIS is effective. 120, 110 is doable. When you're doing portraits, 140 is pretty decent, I would say. You really get good quality out of it at 140 shutter with almost any lenses. So the IBIS is working quite nicely for the purpose of what I do, portraiture. And in terms of autofocus-wise, it is fast enough. IAF is still a little bit behind the competition today, but definitely I would say it's usable for the purpose of portraiture. I mean, as long as the guy is not running around, you probably get a good hit rate with this camera itself. Personally, I prefer single point one-shot AF rather than continuous AF with eye detection. I notice that continuous AF, sometimes this camera tend to drift just a little, and you just get that slightly soft shot. So I personally prefer the single point one shot AF rather than the continuous AF or continuous IAF on this camera itself. And when it comes to image quality, as I said, I'm not going to talk too much about it. It is nice. It's the X-T4 quality. I expect it to be good. I mean, you'll probably enjoy using this camera really from the image quality standpoint. And that's about it really. The rest of it, just look at my previous video, look through it, because it pretty much covers everything I want to talk about. This camera is really nice to use and overall very good if you ask me. If there's really anything to complain about, I would say as I don't really like that the memory card slot is with the battery, and probably the lack of buttons. Sometimes you really just need the extra buttons to operate in the field. That being said, if you are intending to buy a X series camera, or in fact, if you're intending to buy an APS-C camera for your own personal usage, I think this is probably the best in the market. Short of the autofocus, I would say, the autofocus is really not, I would say, it's best in class today. But if not everything else, this is the best in class. It is nice to hold. It feels relatively solid. The lens selection is quite big. And I really enjoy this a lot more than almost any camera I use at this size. The X-T30s I used before, I would say, as also the Sony 6000 series. They are small, they are not nice to hold, and in fact, ergonomically, they are quite terrible. But this pretty much ticks all the box, and he has a decent EVF, a decent enough EVF. LCD maybe not so sharp, but at least it's flippable and you can vlog with it. And the lenses that Fuji has for the purpose of light lenses, or the f2 lenses, are perfect for this camera. It's small, it's light, it's usable. And really, this camera, in terms of portraiture, in terms of landscape, everything, it is a X-T4 in a smaller body in every way. It's just the way you handle it is slightly different. It may not be the best in terms of general button layout, general dials, but in terms of handling, this is definitely better than the X-T4, and I totally enjoy this more than the X-T4 when it comes to an APS-C camera. Overall, I would say if you're going to buy an X series camera or APS-C camera, X-S10 is the camera for you. And that's about it for today. I hope you enjoy this review. I'm looking forward to the new GFX camera and the GFX lens really. And of course, I'll be reviewing more things such as lightings and talk about a little bit of video and talk about some new lenses in the future. But till then, I'll see you again. Bye-bye.